we have covered a lot of things about soil so far. Okay. Today, we're going to describe some ways to maintain the productivity of soil. So, in other words, keep soil at a place where it is able to support life. And we're going to also talk a little bit about deforestation and what effects that has specifically on soil. There are lots of bad effects of deforestation, but today we're going to cover the ones specifically related to soil. Okay? First, let's talk about our dependence on soil, because this is one of the main reasons why soil is so important, is because we depend on it for many things. More products than you probably realize are dependent on being grown in soil. For example, certain textiles or fabrics are made from plant materials. So cotton is made from plant materials. If you are wearing jeans today, jeans are fabricated from cotton, so you are dependent on that. And then lots of other fabrics as well are made from plant materials. So if you do not have those plant materials, then you don't have those fabrics, and then you don't have some of the clothes that you are wearing. On top of that, I'm sure you know that an enormous amount of the food that you eat is either grown in the ground or fed by plants grown in the ground. So what you are eating every day is also dependent on soil being good quality and able to produce food. Obviously, paper is produced from plants, okay? And more things than you use every day use paper. Or more things than you use every day. More things than you think you do use paper. Okay, your textbooks, your notebooks, if you're reading a book, if you're looking at a paper copy of a map, okay? Posters that we hang in walls, flyers that we hand out to people, the programs at the basketball game, the bags they use to put the popcorn in at the basketball game, the napkin you use to wipe your face. All of those are paper products, which are produced from trees, which are grown in soil. And then obviously any furniture or structure that is made out of wood, also grown from plants. So the desks that you're sitting in have wooden tops on them, and the lab benches are made of wood. That bookshelf over there is made of wood. And on top of that, most of your homes are framed out in wood. So even if you can't visibly see the wood in your home structure, it's there and you are dependent on it. So we really need soil to be good quality to produce all these things that we use for our everyday lives. Let's talk about healthy soil. Because of the reasons we just listed, soil is one of the most important resources that we have here on Earth. It provides important minerals, things like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, nitrogen. All those things that plants need in order to grow are in the soil. So if the soil is bad, then the plants don't get those things. In addition to that, the soil also provides stability for growing plants. Okay? There's lots of plants that you could grow them with their roots in the water, and you could give them the nutrients that they needed dissolved in the water, and they would be fine, but they don't then have the stability to grow big and tall and produce lots of food or material. Erosion is a big threat to soils. Wind and water erosion can quickly remove topsoil and make soil less fertile for use in growing crops. So remember when we talked about weathering, and we said weathering is breaking rocks and things down? Erosion is then moving that broken down rock and stuff to another location. So when things like wind and water pick up soil and move it, that's called erosion. So the soil they are going to be able to pick up and move is going to be on the surface of the land, right? If you have flooding wash across your land, it's not going to dig down into the B horizon and just take that soil. It's going to wash the soil that's on the top off. And that, as we know, the soil in the A horizon is the most useful of the soils. It's where all the nutrients are, it's where all of the humus is, and if that gets washed away, soils quickly become less fertile. So we need to be able to do things to prevent erosion. So, in order to keep the soil healthy, we need to, 1, control erosion, 2, find a way to decrease the loss of nutrients. So some nutrients either leach out of soils or they can be removed, and if they're not replenished, then we have a problem there too. And then also we want to conserve water in soils, because obviously plants need water, so we don't want the soils to dry out, but also if we keep the water in the soil instead of letting the water run through the soil, then we are also once again controlling erosion. To do these things, there are lots of different methods that are used, and we're going to talk about just a couple of them. So it's possible that you may even know of some methods that we don't talk about. Crop rotation is one method. What this means is that because each crop removes certain nutrients and then puts some nutrients back into the soil, it's important to rotate your crops so that you're not putting 2 crops in the same soil that take something out 2 years in a row, because then you're going to have less and less of that. So we talked about this when we talked about the nitrogen cycle a little bit, that if you plant corn in the same field year after year after year, it really takes all the nitrogen out of the soil, because corn is a nitrogen heavy crop. It needs a lot of nitrogen. So you can't plant it year after year, or you'll have to keep putting more and more fertilizer on your field because you won't have the nitrogen you need. So instead, you should rotate it out with a plant that actually puts nitrogen back into the soil, like soybeans. So usually, if you're doing a full rotation on your field, what people do is they do a cultivated crop, like corn, followed by a small grain crop, followed by grass. And that helps maintain the nutrient cycle so that plants get what they need, but you still get something productive out of your soil year after year. Contour plowing is another method that we use sometimes. This practice involves following the contours of the land and planting, shouldn't say water, it should just say planting across the direction of water flow. So instead of planting your crops with the direction that water is flowing, which would allow the water to still move freely across your field, if you plant in rows that cut across where the water flows, then you will start to obstruct water flow. And so it'll keep the water on the field more and keep it from flowing off of the field. And it also helps keep wind erosion to a minimum as well. So when you're planting with the contours of the land instead of just like cutting through the land and making everything flat, then you help keep the wind from just blowing everything off of your field. And then we can also use terraces in our fields. So a terrace is like, instead of planting on a slope like this, you plant and then lower and plant and then lower and then plant, so that there are terraces and they're almost like stair steps. And what that does is, by planting on different levels, when water and material flow off of one level, they get stuck on another level instead of just running straight off the field. So it makes the water stick around a little longer. And again, we're slowing down erosion, we're keeping water in the field, we're keeping nutrients in the field. It's overall a good thing. Some practices that exist out there actually work against the conservation of soils. So conservation means we're trying to keep things the same, protect things, and if you are doing some practices, you're actually working against it. So one of those is called deforestation. In this process, a forest area, and this is usually being done in the rainforest area, is clear cut to make room for planting crops. So what I mean by clear cut is they cut down all of the trees in the area, uproot the stumps, everything, and make the area flat so that they can plant crops there. The problem is that the soil in these areas is only rich and full of nutrients because of all of the plants and trees and things that were living in the rainforest. And when those plants and things are gone and no longer putting their organic material back into the soil, unfortunately, that soil quickly becomes poor in nutrient quality and is no longer good for planting crops. So after just a couple of years, that area isn't producing anymore. And so then what do they have to do? Well, they have to move on to another section of the forest and clear cut it and turn it into farmland, and the cycle continues. So not only are we not being productive in the crops, but then now we're also cutting down more of the rainforest, which is necessary for all kinds of other natural cycles that are happening on Earth. So I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you that cutting down, huge chunks of forest is bad for our environment. I'm not saying you can't go cut down a couple of trees, use them for firewood, or clear a tree out of your field, but widespread chopping down of rainforests like this is a bad deal for our environment. Boosting productivity. This is our last little section. So it's inevitable that you're going to wind up with soils that don't get all of the nutrients that they need. Even in nature, the system isn't perfect. Okay? In nature, plant material decays, returns the needed nutrients to the soil, and so on and so forth. But even that isn't perfect. But especially when we start to cultivate crops in an area, what we do is we actually harvest the crops. Well, then that means that those crops don't just sit there in the field and decay and get added back to the soil, so those nutrients aren't getting added back to the soil. So sometimes we have to fertilize the soil and provide it with nutrients that would usually come from the plants decaying there, but is not because we are harvesting those plants away. Some common uses of fertilizers are to add nitrogen to soil, because we know all plants need nitrogen. To neutralize excessive amounts of acid. So if your soil is too acidic, it can not produce good crops. And then finally, adding phosphorus to the soil. Phosphorus is a nutrient that they need. Sometimes there's already phosphorus in the soil, but it's just bound up in rocks. And so sometimes they will put a very mild acid on the field, and that will break down those rocks and put the phosphorus back into the soil. So sometimes they actually add phosphorus, sometimes they just add a mild acid to release the phosphorus. But either way, the goal is to get phosphorus to these plants. All right, this is the end of our notes for today.